welcome to the ITSS Verona member series on cyber, AI, and space. I'm your host, Arnaud Sobrero, and today we're going to discuss the implications of emerging AI technologies to the use of unmanned military systems. The use of unmanned systems like drones for military purposes is not new. From reconnaissance to missile strike missions, drones have become a strategic asset for modern military apparatus. Yet, there is a new trend potentially disrupting the use of drone, the application of artificial intelligence technologies. We are seeing increasing use of unmanned systems with a degree of autonomy powered by machine learning. As highlighted in a UN report, drones used against militia fighters in Libya civil war last year had the ability to select target autonomously. So consequently, we're seeing some kind of new implications in the use of conduct of AI within warfare. So joining us today to discuss those implications is Tate Nurkin. It's a real honor to have Tate here, and he is a world-known expert on defense-related issues. Tate is an independent analyst on defense and geopolitical issues and the founder of OTH Intelligence Group. He's also a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council and with the Center for Strategic and Budgetary Assessments. He is a frequent author and speaker on defense technology, on future military capabilities, as well as the Indo-Pacific defense security issues and the global defense industry. He has also nearly 25 years of experience in the design and delivery of war games and scenario planning exercises, and he's a frequent speaker and author on alternative future methodologies. So welcome, Tate, and it's a great pleasure to have you here.
Yeah, thanks, Arnaud. It's great to be here.
So, Tate, start us off by giving us a snapshot, an overview of the current unmanned system capabilities, both autonomous and non-autonomous, and their current operational use.
Yeah, well, that's a big question, actually. And before I answer it, I wanted to make a quick point, as I've just finished writing a paper on attritable uncrewed systems and the history of UAS use and by militaries. And one of the things that I found that I didn't know prior to starting this was the first use of a unmanned aerial system was in 1849. So there is a long history of development, although not much development happened immediately after that use by the Austrian military. Anyway, there's a long history of development here, and I think we've reached a really interesting stage over the last 5 years or so as some of these fourth industrial revolution technologies have come online, where we are seeing almost an omnidirectional expansion in the interests of uncrewed systems. So, you ask, what is a snapshot overview of current capabilities? Well, it's really hard to bound, to be honest with you, because there are very few missions and capabilities that unmanned systems aren't being at least considered for these days. So I think I'll start by just maybe offering a framework that hopefully will be robust enough to hold up for the next couple of years, that I've talked about before, which is that if you're going to talk about the uncrewed systems market and capabilities, you need to start with 3 V's: the increase in the velocity of demand, as these systems have proven their value and as new technologies come on board and as countries begin to deal with an expanding and complicated threat environment on limited budgets. You need to talk about an expansion in the volume of suppliers, because more countries and private sector companies are realizing that this demand is expanding and are taking advantage of that. Also, in countries like, say, the UAE, which have advancing defense industries, they see unmanned systems as a potentially low barrier of entry way to build their domestic defense industries. And then finally, a variety of solutions. And this is where you see a lot of the technologies coming on board, which are enabling different countries and companies to attack problems of design in different ways. So you can consider, we talk a lot about the difference between vertical takeoff and landing capabilities and maybe fixed wing capabilities, but now you have companies that are really being inventive and innovative, and like Martin and its VBAT technology, which leverages both of those, VTOL and fixed wing capability. So velocity of demand, volume of supply, and variety of solutions, I think, is a good way to start thinking about the capabilities, because certainly uncrewed systems are a much more common feature of military operations.
Right. Well, I think, yeah, thanks for giving us this framework. I think deep dive a bit more into those details.
Sure.
As we are seeing the development of new autonomous concepts, like the modular wingman, designed to advance the capabilities for fifth and sixth generation fighter aircraft.
Yeah.
So, from this perspective, how far AI technologies have advanced, and what type of operational requirements can they address?
Yeah, well, I think these AI capabilities are being integrated and actually now starting to be deployed in some ways. As you mentioned, the UN report about the Kargu 2, the Turkish drone, which has facial recognition software embedded in it and is, at least designed to be able to pick out targets autonomously. The Israelis used drone swarms during this last summer's conflict with Hamas over Gaza. So you're starting to see the actual deployment of autonomous capabilities and some of these exquisite sort of concepts, like lethal autonomous weapon systems and swarms, which are also, by the way, ethically controversial, of course, being deployed. But it's interesting. I think one of the main priorities of the development of UASs in general is the incorporation of AI for autonomy, right? So that systems can, discern, detect, decide without having to consult or call back to a human operator. That's probably a requirement for militaries going forward, given the speed of the pace of operations that we're likely to see. AI is being incorporated to process data at the edge, right? So edge processing, again, trying to speed up the decision making in the OODA loop. So if you can get the unmanned system that is collecting the data to also processing it using machine learning rather than having to send it to some common repository, then that could be a huge advantage. AI to facilitate swarming, which again has been demonstrated in an ISR role, but swarms are at the center of concepts of future air power that are being developed and pursued today. So there are lots of ways that AI is being incorporated, and it's actually fairly mature in many of these. I would also highlight human-machine teaming. You mentioned loyal wingman. There are 8 national loyal wingman programs, or 8 countries that are pursuing these technologies, and then there's a company called Kelly Aerospace, which is developing sort of its own loyal wingman program for export. So there's a lot of activity in the human-machine teaming space that goes beyond, just loyal wingmen. It also is AI is being incorporated in unmanned ground vehicles, unmanned surface vehicles, to be able to coordinate across domains and with human operators.
Interesting that you mentioned the concept about human machine forming a team, and that's obviously something which is having a growing importance. And we have seen obviously last year during the conflict of Nagorno-Karabakh, that conflict really demonstrated the disruptive power of weaponized drone equipped with increasingly autonomous surveillance capabilities.
Yeah.
You mentioned swarms, aerial swarms, I suppose, but I think there also talks about swarms of autonomous unmanned underwater vehicles that potentially undermine the defensive capabilities of a carrier strike group.
Sure.
So with all those new developments, and that's a big question I'm going to ask, I understand that. It's how likely do you see those new developments to disrupt traditional ways of conducting warfare?
Yeah, I think it's highly likely that they'll disrupt traditional ways of conducting warfare. That doesn't mean that they will not swarms in particular don't have vulnerabilities of their own, which we can get to in a little bit. But I saw some really interesting analysis. I think there was an article printed in the published in the Diplomat that recounted a war game in which a carrier was sunk by a swarm of USVs. I think it was a double ISS exercise. But yeah, it's really interesting stuff, and I think it's the ability to return mass to the battlefield, which in some cases was avoided given long-range precision strike and because masses of people in crude systems. But to be able to do that, to overwhelm defenses using uncrewed systems, whether they be surface vehicles, underwater vehicles, ground vehicles, or aerial vehicles, I think is going to be a prominent feature of future operational concepts. It already is. We see it in the use of, well, I think, you see it in Syria with the Russian base being sort of under constant attack, not from very sophisticated uncrewed aerial systems, but nonetheless the ability to overwhelm and move faster than defenses is, I think, something that will be very disruptive. Again, there may be responses, but it will at least start an iterative competition to figure out how to gain advantage.
Yeah. Interesting that you mentioned the Diplomat article. That was exactly what I was referring to.
Okay, right.
But so obviously you mentioned that it's going to have a massive effect on how we conduct warfare. So I think the next question is, how do we counter that with all those technologies, tactics available? How do we counter those emerging threats? For example, and that could be a separate question, but with the advent of advanced cyber capabilities, for example, do you see a scenario where an opponent can hack an autonomous system and divert it to its original attacker, for example?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are a couple of great questions in there. And the first around the cyber attack is, I think data security is one of the long poles of the tent here for deployment of any application of AI for uncrewed systems or really in any capacity. There is at least a theoretical vulnerability that when you have all of this data that is being processed, that the algorithms can be corrupted to do things that they weren't designed to do, to make the platforms and systems do what they're not designed to do. And certainly, that the data could be altered for that purpose as well. So data security is going to be a really big area. And I think that is also perhaps gives some insight into some of the defenses against swarms and things like air-launched effects, which we didn't talk about in the previous question, but that's another area of real investment, which is it's not just swarms of individual uncrewed systems. It is uncrewed systems that are swarmed and then they release swarms of uncrewed systems. It's kind of a nesting doll concept that we see programs around the world investing in this, like the GROM program in Russia that is able to release, small drones, or Valkyrie has done that here in the United States. So I think the responses are at a couple of different levels. One is directed energy. I think there's a lot of investment in kind of high-powered microwaves to deal with drone swarms. I'm not sure it's 100% refined yet, but there's definitely been progress in a number of companies throughout the world who are looking at how to leverage high-powered microwaves to deal with fast-moving swarms. But I do think that the increased importance of what the Defense of Japan 2020, last year's paper, called the new domains, cyber and the electromagnetic spectrum, offer another avenue to deal with swarms. Swarms are great and they're effective if they operate as they're intended to, but if you can find ways to, again, change the algorithms or disrupt their communications, and then maybe you have a solution that doesn't require you to fire a lot of kinetic effects that probably wouldn't be fast enough to keep up with them anyway.
Interesting. I'm just curious to hear from your perspective. You mentioned a couple of programs, couple of nations, Russia and US. Are there other nations advancing their capabilities in drone swarms, AI-powered drones as well? Sure.
Yeah, I think it's a pretty common component of uncrewed system development throughout the world. I mean, Turkey, you've seen already that they have the capacity for AI-enabled systems. and they've become a much more prominent exporter. You know, China has spent a lot of time, energy, and effort looking at drone swarms, and they've had a number of very highly publicized tests that indicate that this is the direction that they are having some success in developing swarming technologies. But, you know, again, having just looked at these 8 countries that are really developing attritable and loyal wingman capabilities, swarming is part of all of them. So, you know, the U.S. Has a number of different programs for swarming, both expendable UASs or even attritable ones. The DARPA Gremlins program comes to mind. Australia has its air power teaming system, which again, smaller numbers of swarms associated with that. It's really more 3 to 6 aircraft that are working in conjunction with a crewed aircraft. Russia is certainly looking at these swarms. Part of the India combat air teaming system is something called air-launched effects. I forget, the acronym is Alpha S. It's a swarming capability that can be launched from a drone carrier. So I think this is really part of almost all of these loyal wingman programs that are being developed currently. And it goes beyond just those loyal wingman programs as well. There are independent sort of swarming, but I think it's become a feature of how militaries around the world think about the future of air power.
Very interesting. How it's fascinating to see how those developments are changing military, also R&D capabilities, I presume. When we talk about AI and military systems, there's this big elephant in the room about ethics. So obviously, from your perspective, what are the ethical issues touched by AI? Is there a risk that the machine will replace the man in a foreseeable future?
Well, I think there are a couple of important categories of ethical concerns. The first one is that the AI will do exactly what it's intended to do. And that, I think, is the concern around lethal autonomous weapon systems, that you have a robot that is capable of finding, tracking down, and potentially killing human beings without ever having a human pull the trigger or authorize that intervention. And that is disturbing. And I think that's why many militaries have been very reticent to say that they will fully embrace that. And you have, you know, like the U.S. military saying that, you know, humans need to be on the loop of this decision-making process. So that, you know, so there are some countries that have decided to self-restraint on this. In other words, not enabling a fully autonomous strike. So I think that's, but I don't know how long that will last, because other countries may not do that or have not done that. And in the end, I think there's now in some places, again, like the United States and elsewhere, a sense that, okay, well, can we say that we won't use autonomous strike against humans, but we will use it against other machines? And once you start going down those roads, obviously it becomes very difficult to determine whether you're targeting a machine or a human, and there's lots of complexities there. So that's a really complex issue, and one that I think rightfully is getting more attention, and thankfully is getting more attention as these systems now are, like I said, being deployed. The second one is that the machines don't do what they're supposed to do, right? So that they either start making decisions on their own, or the algorithms have been corrupted, or there's been bias baked into the algorithms that make them make mistakes. And here again, I think this is a really big issue. It's perhaps in some ways a little easier to control. With a little bit of humility, we can build in a little more time to make sure that these algorithms are doing exactly what they're supposed to do. And obviously, as we mentioned before, data protection will help at least defend against some of these efforts to corrupt AI. So I know it's a complicated issue, and it's one that keeps me up at night, and I'm not sure I have the right answer as how best to proceed, but I'm glad that there's a conversation around it now, because I don't think that conversation was robust enough going back 3 or 4 years.
I think it's a very dynamic landscape. I mean, there's a lot of different part of the world are trying to bring new laws, regulations, norms, I think that's also missing here. But to continue,
I'm sorry to interrupt, but I think this is a really good point on norms and standards. One of the things that I have been encouraged by, and this is led by the Joint Artificial Intelligence Center in the United States, but there is a basic consortium, basically, of 16 countries that get together a couple of times a year to talk about ethics of AI, to talk about big issues that aren't technical issues necessarily, shaping the future of military AI. And so I think having those types of collaborative forums is absolutely critical to establishing standards that will reduce the risk of either full-on embrace of lethal autonomous weapon systems, which would be which is not a salutary outcome, or of having AI that is developed in ways that are unsafe.
I have one more last question for you. It's more to do about your outlook. For the next 5 to 10 years. It's very difficult to predict since it's very dynamic. But how do you see this situation evolving, and with the potentiality of having a conflict between machines?
Yeah. I mean, I think that is the direction it's headed. I don't know. It's hard for me to put a time frame around when you have machine on machine conflict at scale. I hope we don't see it, because obviously, that would have meant something has gone terribly wrong. But I think in terms of the capabilities to do that, yeah, I think those capabilities are, if not imminent, within the next 5 years. You'll start to see the deployment of sort of loyal wingmen. You'll start to see the deployment of these air-launched effects programs. You'll start to see deployment of drone swarms in a way that that could be very, very concerning. But yeah, I think that's where it's headed, and the incorporation of AI. There are some constraints. Certainly the ethical constraints are there. We've talked about that. Training is another one that these things you probably don't think about when you first start talking about advanced technologies, but getting the training right for people to use these systems, to make them safe in use, and make sure that humans are trusting the machines they're working with, and vice versa. So there are lots of other constraints that could slow it down a little bit, but absent some hugely disruptive development, I think we're on a this is the direction the most uncrewed system development is taking, is the incorporation of AI.
Well, brilliant insights, Tate. It's very fascinating how this will evolve. So thanks again for your time here, and I hope to see you again on this program.
Yeah, would love to. Thanks so much for the opportunity.